Order. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the first public evidence session of the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Select Committee. We are delighted to have with us this afternoon Steve Reid, the Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. Secretary of State, you're very welcome. I hope this is just the first of many appearances you will have in front of us. It is the intention of the committee that in providing scrutiny for your department, as Parliament requires us to do, that we should also contribute to providing better value and better outcomes for all our constituents at the end of the day. So I hope that while we have different jobs to do and occasionally we will take different views, that this will be something which will ultimately be better for everyone as a consequence. Can I ask you, Secretary of State, just for the benefit of the record, to introduce yourself and your colleagues that are with you today?
Sure. First of all, thank you for your welcome, Chair. It's delighted to appear before the committee. I think I know most members, but not all. But perhaps over the coming years, I hope we'll get to know each other better. I'm looking forward very much to working collaboratively with the committee. I started out my parliamentary career on a select committee, so I understand and value the work that you do. And just as I think you're mostly, apart from the chair, new MPs learning the ropes in your new jobs, I'm still a relatively new Secretary of State, fair to say learning the ropes in mine as well. So I suspect we can do some of that learning together. I'm Steve Reid, I'm the Secretary of State for the Environment, and I have two of the department's Director Generals with me, David Hill and Emily Miles.
Okay. Originally it had been my intention that we would use this as an opportunity to explore the sort of wider strategy of the department, maybe a good broad general look ahead, and that's still important. I hope that we will be able to get to that business today. But you'll not be surprised to know that this is perhaps one of those occasions where we have the urgent which will have to trump the important for today. So I want to kick off this afternoon's evidence session by asking you a bit about some of the changes that were made as a consequence of the budget at the end of last month, and in particular the changes in relation to inheritance tax, agricultural property relief and business property relief. Before that, though, I want to just take one step backwards here, Secretary of State. Before the election, maybe even before the budget, I don't know, it was your policy not to interfere with APR and BPR. So when that was your policy, what did you hope to achieve with it?
Well, I mean, one's policy has to reflect the circumstance in which one is taking decisions. That's right. The policy must always reflect the circumstance in which you're taking decisions. And although we did not have plans to change the inheritance tax or APR circumstance applying to farmers or landowners, as you'll be aware too, after the election, the incoming government discovered a £22 billion black hole in the public finances just to stand still, and that didn't allow for any investment to repair our absolutely shattered and broken public services. We have a National Health Service absolutely on its knees.
Look, if anyone's playing Select Committee bingo, you can mark £22 billion off your card there. But it was the purpose. If you hadn't come into that and you had stuck with your policy, what was the purpose of that? What did you hope to achieve with it?
Well, the intention would have been, and the Chancellor and the current Prime Minister made it clear at the time, the intention was always to fix the foundations of the economy. But doing that work required us, in the end, I know you were making light of it there, but a £22 billion black hole in the public finances is an incredibly serious problem. Just finding £22 billion doesn't give you anything to improve public services which were performing at their worst. Right. The intention all the way through in the run-up to the election in the years before that was to make sure that we took the necessary decisions to stabilise the economy. You saw what happened to it under Liz Truss's premiership when it crashed, sending mortgage rates spiralling, interest rates spiralling, prices in the shops spiralling, and out of out of control cost of living crisis infuriating people up and down the country. We had an electorate looking for change, but the circumstances as they appeared before the election were different after the election, because we believe the previous government deliberately covered up the state of the public finances.
Let me reframe my questions slightly differently then. The purpose of APR and BPR for governments before yours, going right the way back, was that it would be a mechanism by which the succession and the continuation of family farmers passing from one generation to the other would be achieved. Was that ever part of your thinking?
Well, it didn't exist, did it? The relief didn't exist until 1992 when it was introduced. So presumably up until that point, despite that relief not existing, farms had passed from generation to generation. And I would hope they will still continue to pass from generation to generation after these changes have been made as well. I know, for instance, the Liberal Democrats at one point proposed changing IHT to reduce the level of the relief. So it was something that had been discussed along the way by different political parties, but it didn't exist before 1992, and yet these intergenerational inheritances had happened, presumably, in all of the decades leading up until that point. So yes, the intention would be, as we set around fixing the foundations, stabilising the economy, reinvesting in our public services, of course we want family farming to continue just as it always has done.
Okay, to move on to where we are today, you've said only the richest estates will be asked to pay, not small family farms. What's your definition of a small family farm?
Well, I'll tell you we came to that statement, Chair, if I may.
Please.
There's a lot of figures flying around at the moment. We all are aware of the protests going on outside. I'm very aware of the concerns farmers feel. I've been engaging with the NFU, the CLA, Tenant Farmers Association. Some of the people in this room, we were having a chat before we came in as well, and some of them I've met before as well. So I understand people's concerns, but the best measure for what's going to happen that we've got is the last year that we have for hard data for claims for APR, and that was 21-22. Where there is a set of data that the HMRC have provided. The Treasury have run projections based on that take into account the different factors that were at play in looking at those figures. So that's APR, business property relief, capital rollover allowances, the nil-rated allowances that people are permitted when they're making transfers of assets through inheritance after death. And their projections showed that around 500 and probably less estates would be affected by these changes in any year, and the rest of the sector would not be. Now, if you look at the percentages that takes you to, that's around 3/4 of estates not affected and around 1/4 affected, but assuming no behavioural change. In all likelihood, people seeing the change to APR are likely to change their behaviours by taking tax advice and then changing what they're doing based on that tax advice, tax planning like any business would do. That is likely to reduce the liability even further from that figure of around
we're
a
changing
quarter.
Tax
And
law
just if I may,
people will avoid it.
If I might make one further point, because people have queried whether these figures from HMRC and the Treasury are accurate or not. These figures have been validated by the Independent Office for Budget Responsibility and the Independent Institute for Fiscal Studies, the independent financial think tank. So I have every reason, and we should all have every reason, to believe that this data, projections based on actual hard data, is accurate, and that the vast majority of farms will not be affected by the changes to APR, which is what I've said.
Well, I'll come to the vast majority of farms in a second, but the figures that you validated were in relation to applications for relief using ABR. There was previously an interaction between ABR and BPR, which has also changed. Yeah. So do you expect that change to have an impact on how the estates will be caught in the future.
After concerns were raised with me, I met with officials from the Treasury to try and understand better how the projections had worked, and they had taken into account these other factors as well. So it wasn't just APR.
So the farmers who are around the House of Commons today have also looked at their situation. They know their business, and there's a lot more than 500 here saying that they're going to be affected. Are they wrong?
Well, assuming these projections from HMRC validated by the OBR and the IFS are correct, then many of them probably happily are wrong, because there are things that they can do to plan their tax affairs, as most businesses or asset owners would do, to limit their liability. I mean, the numbers I've heard bandied around are enormous and very, 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 very frightening if people were to believe them.
Based on DEFRA data, of course.
Huh?
Based on DEFRA data on the size of farms.
It's based on DEFRA data, which shows you the value of a farm, and then people have drawn a straight line to an inheritance tax liability, but you can't do that, because ownership is much more complex than one person, one farm. And when you take into account these other factors, as the Treasury has done, as the OBR has done, as the IFS have done, they all say that less than 500 would be affected a year.
So let's just look at this question of behavioural change. By that, do you mean more transfers into Vivos?
Well, I'm not going to give tax advice. The circumstances change from individual to individual.
What other behavioural change are you expecting?
That is one of the options available. There are many options that would be available, but the best thing to do isn't to listen to a minister of the Crown as to what you should do with your tax affairs. It's to listen to your tax advisor, who can give you detailed advice based on your own personal circumstances to ensure that you are managing your tax affairs as effectively and efficiently as possible.
Okay, like you, I'm not going to be into the business of giving tax advice, you'll be pleased to hear. But the tax advice that farmers will have had hitherto is hold on to your farm, because that's the best way of ensuring succession. There are people farming into their 70s and indeed their 80s now. Do you know why they're farming as late as that in their life?
Yes, of course I do. I've been speaking to a lot of people about these circumstances. So one of the reasons that there is a delay in the implementation of this is to allow people to start planning their affairs. So it doesn't come into force until April 2026. It won't be in the finance bill until 2026. So that gives people more time to start planning.
And if you make an inter-Vivos transfer, it's 7 years, is it not?
With a taper, that's right.
So if I were sitting here as a farmer in my late 70s or my 80s, having relied on this idea, that was my inheritance tax planning, that I would hold on to, I would get the relief. I probably don't have a pension beyond the state pension, because I've been putting the money, such as it is, back into the farm. There's a better than fair likelihood that a lot of these people will not get to hand on their farm as they had expected or intended. Is that fair?
Well, everybody gets their inheritance tax exemptions. An individual can pass on with a property, 500,000. That can be transferred to a spouse if the predeceases. That takes it up to if they're married or civil partners. That takes it up to $1 million. Each individual can have an APR allowance of $1 million. It may not be restricted to a couple. There may be other people involved as well. I mean, it starts to get complicated because you're talking about very different circumstances, case by case. The best thing to do is for people to take professional tax advice and manage their tax affairs appropriately. But I don't think the public will consider it unreasonable that people with multi-million-pound assets should not pay any inheritance tax if in certain circumstances. And as I said before,
the public's view on that would
from the data projections, the vast majority of farmers will still pay nothing.
What does your own department say about the return on that £3 million asset? What's the revenue that they earn on the basis of that, in percentage terms.
In what term? In what are you talking?
DEFRA figures tell us that the return on that family farm, that £3 million farm, is 0.5%.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I completely understand. Profitability within the farming sector is very low at the moment. So that's why some of the things we're looking at is how we can help improve the profitability
it's not just
of
at
farming.
the moment. This is not something that's just happened. Profitability has been like this for decades.
Well, it's got worse since 2018. Actually, if you're looking at the figures, it's got more and more difficult. It was hit very hard by the escalating energy prices that we had a few years ago, which have stayed high ever since then. There are things that we can do about all of those to improve farm profitability. We don't just have to accept that the sector is stuck in some doom loop where they can never make any money. We have to support farming to become a profitable, thriving sector. And there are steps that we can do to help with that, and the budget seeks to do that. So as part of the budget, we allocated a sum of £5 billion over 2 years, which is the biggest budget for sustainable food production in our country's history.
So the early ending of basic payments in England, that's going to help the profitability of farming, is it?
Well, I go back again. We had a £22 billion black hole in the public finances to plug just to stand still. If we then wanted to raise funding to improve failing public services like the NHS, like schools, like affordable housing, like potholes cratering roads in the countryside, just as well as everybody else, we had to find the money to fix those problems so we can stabilise the economy and start to grow the economy and then properly fund our public services. That involved decisions that I fully accept are very, very difficult, and were not decisions that we had anticipated before the general election. But by taking them, we can rebuild the economy, rebuild the foundations of the economy to allow it to grow, rebuild our public services in ways that will benefit farmers as well as everybody else living in the countryside, but also take action to boost farming profitability.
Let's just come on to this then. I want to move on to tenant farmers in a second, but I was speaking to farmers in my own constituency at the weekend, 300-acre farms, probably in the region of about 3 million, including stock and machinery. So they're earning £25,000 a year or thereabouts on that. If they have to pay inheritance tax on the value above the 1 million, where's that money going to come from? It's not going to come from the income. They're going to be selling land, aren't they?
Well, it wouldn't be them. It would be their heirs, to be absolutely accurate. Because this, of course, only comes after somebody has died. It's an inheritance tax. So it's not that individual continuing in the business. They're by definition not in the business anymore. And it's a very established principle that, when you have a very valuable asset, on death, a share of it will go back to the state for people who are very wealthy. What I want to do to help farmers today is help their profitability while they're alive and while they're running those businesses. So I think the £5 billion going into SFI will help with that. I think the work we're doing to set up GB Energy and harness the power, wind, wave, solar and nuclear will cut energy bills. The work on planning reforms will allow diversification to go ahead faster. I've spoken to farmers who have started generating their own energy, and it's taken them 10 years to get planning permission to connect to the national grid. We can turn that into months rather than years to help farms diversify. We're looking at how we can back British produce by using the power of our own public sector purse to buy more British produce.
We're getting a wee bit off the beaten track here, Secretary of State.
Well, I'm talking about, it's not really, because I'm talking about how we make the sector profitable.
Yeah.
And you're telling me it's not profitable as though that's a God-given fact of life forever. But it isn't. There's things that we as a government can do to help the sector succeed.
We'll go over that when you come back next time. I want to move on to the question of tenant farmers. They're obviously going to be affected differently. I don't think anybody goes into tenant farming to protect their hundreds of millions. What assessment has the Treasury made on the impact of these changes on tenant farmers?
Well, tenant farmers are going to be affected differently by this, aren't they? Because by definition, they don't own the land and they won't be paying inheritance tax on the land. I think there are potentially...
Do you think it's foreseeable that their landlords might want to end tenancies and bring the asset back in hand so that they can manage it in their own most tax-efficient way, as you've been suggesting people should do?
There's always a risk when you've got a landlord that they might sell their asset. But there's a chance that they won't as well. There's a chance that tenants who have wanted to buy their own land or some of their own land will have that opportunity as well. Some of the other changes may well reduce the value of land as well. The phasing out of BPS may have an impact of reducing the value of land. The APR changes may have the effect of reducing the value of land. That reduces liability after death.
Is it government policy that you want to see the value of land falling?
The value of land is extremely high, and it's gone up way above the rate of inflation for years now. If you speak to young farmers, they will tell you how difficult it is to ever get their opportunity to own their own land because of the price of land. And if you look at last year, the majority of agricultural land that was sold went to non-farmers.
You said 50% on Twitter this morning.
If we can make land more affordable to farmers, then there's a chance, if there is a change in ownership of tenanted farms, that some of those tenants can buy their own land or buy some of their own land. So there are opportunities. I don't think you should look at change as being inherently negative. Changes can bring positives as well, and by reducing land values, which is a possibility in this, I'm not saying it's definite, but we can open up the chance of farm ownership to more young farmers. And at a time when the average age of a farmer is around 60, and we need to get younger people into the sector, boosting profitability and making it more affordable surely are desirable outcomes.
Okay, my final question on this then. The Tenant Farmers Association and their evidence to us suggested actually that leases which were constituted to run in excess of 10 years could be the ground for exempting estates from inheritance tax. That's pretty much in line with some of the suggestions of the HoC review. Do you think you've missed an opportunity here to encourage more tenancies to be extended, which has surely got to be something that would be good?
Well, I think there are things we could do to improve business opportunities for tenants, and that's why we've announced our intention to create the new position of a tenant farming commissioner. The point of that role would be to improve collaboration between the tenant farmer and the landowner, to ensure that the code of practice for tenant farming is properly enforced, to be an advocate for tenant farming to government and to other agencies, and to provide appropriate advice both to tenant farmers and to their landlords. So there are changes we are making that I think will help. I'm always happy to meet George Dunn and the TFA. I've met him regularly already, and I'll keep doing that. Very important that we do what we can to support tenant farming. They're about a third of all farmland in the country, and we shouldn't neglect that.
Is that a division? Order. The sitting is suspended. Order. The sitting resumes. Apologies for that. That's just for those who are visiting Parliament, part of the delights of the parliamentary day. But we pick up the thread. Secretary of State, you'll be pleased to hear, I think I've hogged the questions for long enough, but I have a few of my colleagues who have questions to put to you, and I'm going to go to Jane Kirkham first.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Secretary of State. Just a couple of questions. To go back to ownership initially, the Treasury claims data is based on some numbers that were quite interesting. So 27% of those claims assets were under 250,000 and 23% were under $500,000, which seemed quite low. So my question is, what analysis was done on that split? So were they hobby farmers, smallholders, part owners of larger farms, or maybe even landlords? Because that obviously will have some impact on whether they were the people actually producing the food. So of course food security is ultimately important here. So there was that, and then looking a bit more at rolling together the BPR and the APR, because of course those people who are actually farming will have both. Potentially, even if they're tenant farmers, they will be looking at claiming BPR relief for their machinery, their livestock, etc. So would that have more of an impact on them, because they're the ones actually doing the farming, therefore going back to them be the ones involved in the food security?
Yeah, no, I'm sure you're absolutely right. I'm sure there's a wide variety of farms, of properties, of ownership in there. The point I was trying to make is that is the best starting point we've got. That data is the only hard data we've got for how many claims were actually made against APR for this kind of land. And the Treasury's projections have taken into account the interaction of APR with BPR with other capital allowances, capital rollovers, the nil rate allowances as well, and then projected it forwards. I mean, it might be worth the committee, if you're interested in the specifics of how they've done their calculations or what assumptions fed into that, to speak to them directly. That's something that I have asked for as well.
I think if you could persuade Treasury to provide us with that detail and that data, that would be enormously helpful. It might even be in their own best interests in terms of messaging. Sarah.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Secretary of State. This, for many farmers, will be the final nail in their coffin, or that's how they feel at the moment. Have you recognised, therefore, the impact that this decision is going to make on many farmers' lives? I think we probably have had many years of turbulence in the farming sector, through trade deals, through the transition from CAP to ELMS, the energy price increases, input increases, and various others. So many farmers feel that they are at the bottom of that trough. Many are devastated, as many of my colleagues here have had farmers visiting Parliament today. I'm from a farming family. I feel that very deeply about the devastation that farmers are going to have. I've had nothing in my family conversations over the last couple of weeks about how this is going to impact my family. So a couple of questions that have come from my family, but also farmers that I've spoken to over the last couple of weeks. The transition period is not long enough, particularly for older farmers. We need at least 7 years to be able to transition, to adequately prepare and to make those considerations. I would also like to know what constitutes an active farmer, as opposed to those that are looking to invest in land. I'd also like to know, because there is that disparity on some of the figures that have been put out around the calculations. So could I have an indication whether an impact assessment has been made regarding the disagreement between the departments? And I'd also like to know whether the department has actually able to qualify what a modern farm looks like.
Secretary
Packed a lot into that one. Let me start with your, the point you made about how people feel. I completely recognise that any change is going to be going to be very worrying for people, particularly after, since 1992. This allowance has existed. So I completely understand how unsettling that is. And that's why I think it's important that I'm listening, and I know colleagues on all sides of the House are listening as well. People were just now in the lobby coming up to me, telling me that they've been listening to farmers today and what farmers have been saying. That's a very important part of what we do as parliamentarians, is to listen to people and then feed in what they're saying. But I will go back to this point. The data that we've got from the HMRC, validated by the OPR, validated by IFS, shows that even without behavioural change, the vast majority of farmers would not be affected, and that only around a quarter of claimants would pay anything. And those claimants can take measures on advice that can further reduce their liability. So those points still... Those points are still valid. In terms of what you were saying about who is buying up agricultural land, the statistics I saw show that year on year, increasingly, agricultural land that comes up for sale is being bought by non-farmers. Now I can get writing to you because that comes from the Treasury, so I can get the detail of that and write to you about precisely how they define a non-farmer. I mean, I can make as good a guess as you from the language that is being used, that it's somebody that wasn't farming previously. But if you look at it year on year, more and more agricultural land is going to those people, and year on year, the value of land is going up way above inflation. I think for the last year it was something like twice the rate of inflation for non-agricultural land or property prices in general, and that's been a trend going on for quite a long time. So I suspect a part of that is being driven by wealthy individuals who are buying up agricultural land potentially as a means to avoid an inheritance tax liability, and some of them will be very open about that. If you're listening to tax advisors or tax consultants, some of them will freely give this opinion in public. One of the best ways to shield a large amount of money from inheritance tax is to buy agricultural land. Now, that's not because they're interested in farming or in food security or food production. It's because they're interested in avoiding that liability that they would otherwise incur. Now, that can't have been the intention of APR when it was introduced. So I think we do need to look at that. We need to look at the impact that's having on land values and how that is pricing farmers out of being able to access this land. But as I said, throughout the session so far, based on the independently verified data the Treasury have supplied, the vast majority of farmers will take nothing, and if they take action on advice, that liability, even for those who will incur some charge, can be further reduced.
Okay. I've got 4 colleagues now wanting to come in, so can I ask everybody to keep it in chart, because there are other areas that we do need to cover. Charlie.
Thank you, Chair. I absolutely agree with you, Secretary of State, that listening is very important, but you're in the privileged position to be able to listen and then do something about it. So let's go back to the beginning of this policy change on property relief. Was this an idea that you presented to the Treasury, or was it something the Treasury imposed on DEFRA?
I'm not going to get into the mechanics of government decision making. I'm happy to talk about the decision that was made in the budget. I think that's what matters. The budget is endorsed by the whole of the government, and we all stand behind those decisions.
Okay, I'll rephrase that. What representations have you made on behalf of farming to the Treasury in relation to these?
Well, again, I'm not going to air the private conversations that I have with colleagues. We stand behind the decisions. I'm happy to defend those decisions. I'm also happy to listen to views about how those decisions could be dealt with differently for the future. I think it's important that all politicians are listening as much as we can, and I have a responsibility to do that as a member of the Cabinet.
Would you be willing to alter your course on this?
The decision has been taken in this case. That I think that the thing that I'm picking up is that a lot of people who, based on the Treasury data, will not be affected by changes in APR currently believe that they will be. And I think it's very important those people get adequate advice. There's some signposting available from DEFRA on the Farming Resilience Fund, is that what it's called?
Yes.
I think that's what it's called, sorry, it's Emily's question. That people can apply to get help to signpost them to advice. But businesses have tax accountants, they have advisors, that would include farmers. I think it's important they speak to those people as well to get accurate information about how this will affect them.
Okay. Sarah.
Thank you, Chair. As Secretary of State, I think the best help would actually be to reconsider. You say you're listening, but it is really very much listening with closed ears at this point. One of my main concerns as well is that you have sort of set the threshold very low at 1 million. And one of my questions is why, if you are actually wanting to tax those very, very, very wealthy farms, then why didn't you set it at an appropriate level? Because you must appreciate you are directly targeting the working farmers that you're so trying to protect. Because, again, another question, do you even know how much a sort of a new tractor and a new combine harvester will cost? Because 3 of those sort of vehicles, which are the working equipment, will take you to the 1 million threshold. So why didn't you set the threshold higher? Because you're automatically pulling them in at this point.
You say we should listen, I should listen, but I think that applies to all of us in Parliament as well. And if you listen to the public in the countryside as well as elsewhere,
Which we are.
and I saw data on the views of people in the countryside just yesterday, their top issue is the cost of living and how that's affecting them. Their second issue is the National Health Service and the decrepit state of that. If this government had not taken action to plug the £22 billion black hole that we were left by the previous government, and that is just to stand still, then the cost of living crisis would simply get worse and worse and worse, as it did under the previous government, and the National Health Service would continue in free fall, as it did under the previous government. Now, you can't just magic money out of nowhere to fix these problems. Liz Truss tried that, and it crashed the economy and made it worse. So I'm just explaining why I listen. I'm just explaining why I'm listening to people in the countryside and why we're taking the action that we're taking. I know you don't like my answers, with the greatest respect.
Nobody gets heard if both are talking at the same time.
I know she doesn't like my answers, but I've been listening to people in the countryside, and this is what they want us to do. That has involved taking difficult decisions. You can't just wish the difficult decisions away and only do the nice things. Difficult decisions have to be taken to fix the foundations of the economy, and that's what we've done. Now, the £1 million threshold for many people will be far higher in reality than £1 million. If you're a couple with a property and you're passing on to a family member, that becomes £3 million. A lot of people would think that £3 million of assets being passed on to an heir without incurring inheritance tax is quite generous. And not only that, but when the inheritance tax liability occurs, it's at half the rate that anyone else would have to pay. And instead of being paid in one go, like anyone else, it can be spread over 10 years. That is still a generous package of support for people. But it will only apply to the wealthiest individuals and the biggest farms. As I said all the way through this, the vast majority of estates will pay nothing as a result of these changes, but they will all benefit from the repairing of our broken National Health Service that farmers, people in the countryside, just like the rest of the population, rely on.
I was just to say, just based on a typical 200-acre farm, though, with an annual profit about 27,300, their IHT bill would come out 435,000 over a 10 years period. That would require them to reallocate 159% of their capital employed each year. So this isn't realistic to pay this. But also, what the farmers are actually telling us is on the ground and practically they can't forward plan. They can't because if they know that potentially they won't invest, because if they invest more, that will push up their bills. And their only measures are therefore to sell land or to not reinvest. So I don't see that you are allowing farmers to grow and be the profitable industry that you're saying. You are actually physically harming them, and that is what they're all saying outside, Secretary of State.
Well, you can create a case study to back up the argument that you want to make, but that case study could also involve somebody transferring ownership 7 years before death, and then the IHT liability is zero. So, I think the best thing we can do is rely on the one place where we've got hard data, that is from the HMRC. These are actual claims that were made in 21-22, the last year for which it's available. Look at the projections for how it rolls forwards, and the vast majority of farmers will pay nothing.
Right. Henry, then Andrew, and then we're moving on.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Secretary of State. I just wanted to touch from a devolved point of view quickly. We've now got two, particularly from a Welsh perspective, because we now have two Labour governments working hand in hand, which is incredibly positive. And I wanted to ask whether there had been an impact assessment in terms of how the budget from an agricultural perspective would have impacted people in Wales from DEFRA and working closely with the colleagues, your counterpart being Hugh Rankin-Davies in this case. We know in Wales that a greater percentage of workers in the agricultural industry speak Welsh than any other sector in Wales, and that's 43% of the industry is significantly higher than the population as a whole, which is 19%. So I'm interested to know whether there'd been, in terms of that dialogue across government between you and yourself, between you and Hugh Rankin-Davies.
Well, DEFRA doesn't carry out impact assessments on tax measures. That's just how that is. I think the best way, I mean, we can see what's going on in farming. I can see the low levels of profitability in farming. And many of the changes that we're looking to make are intended to boost the profitability of farming. I don't think it's a very good argument to say, that you've got farmers owning sizable and valuable assets in land, but because they're not very profitable, then they shouldn't have to pay any inheritance tax when that land and that asset is transferred to the next generation in the way that nearly every other asset would be. The answer isn't just to accept low profitability in the sector, it's to look at what we can do to drive profitability up in the sector. So by using and protecting the SFI budgets and the other parts of the budget for sustainable food production in a way that we've done in this budget, we're helping to drive farmers towards more profitable, more environmentally and financially sustainable models of farming for the future, where their input costs will be lower and therefore their profitability will be higher. In looking at what we can do to lower their energy costs, use government procurement, or public sector procurement at least, to back British produce, look at what we can do to get a better veterinary deal with the European Union so we can get British food exports moving across the border into Europe as they used to. There's been a 20% decline in that since 2018. All of that will help to boost the profitability of farming. And I think rather than just sitting back and saying farming is not profitable and accepting it, we need to look at what we can do to boost their profitability. Is there anything else,
Henry, that you're wanting to?
I guess it was more from, it wasn't necessarily that, because I know we touched on a lot of the stuff you were just, it was more that relationship between you and your counterpart in Welsh Government and looking at how you know those discussions and how they're evolving over time, particularly in relation to the budget. It wasn't necessarily, I know we've touched on a lot of in terms of return on capital and everything.
Yeah. Well, I think, I don't think it's appropriate to share the detail of individual conversations. I have had many conversations with all of the devolved governments to make sure that we're working.
Who asked you to remove the ring fence?
Sorry?
Just out of interest, who asked you to remove the ring fence for devolved administrations?
Well, this is a government that believes in devolution.
Okay.
And
so
I think by giving the devolved administrations more control over their resources supports devolution. I think your party supports devolution as well.
Indeed, for many, many years,
you
believe in home rule. But you weren't asked.
Sorry?
You weren't asked by the devolved administrations to remove the ring fence.
No, but as a government, we were elected as a UK government with a big agenda for devolution. Yeah. So that's our mandate for that. Yeah.
Andrew.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Secretary of State. And I'd like to put on record my thanks to farmers in my patch and defence who've been in today but spoke to me since the budget, because there are, any change on taxation is going to be complex and we need to work through it in an intelligent and patient way. And I think farmers I've met certainly have been embracing that as part of it. I suppose the place I want to do is, one, just do you recognise and accept that this isn't a tax change done in year zero? I find it interesting that some people talk about the fact that this is, that farmers are in a good place. Farmers haven't been in a good place because of harvest, the weather, and the cost. So that focus on profitability. One of the elements we haven't touched on yet that farmers in my patch have talked about, which is the basket of measures you've brought in. And that focus, particularly, we've looked at one element of it today, but this $5 billion, the record level setting budget you've talked about, people are really interested in how that relates to the total package that farmers get. And if you could say a bit more about how, if there's a change here, what your thoughts are about how farmers can access that extra budget in the years ahead, to build up that profitability, because wherever we start from now, increasing profitability for farming has to be one of the objectives if we want to build resilience in the supply chain. And how does that element fit together with this other element you're making?
Yeah, no, I agree very much with the points that he's making. I mean, within the 5 billion over the next 2 years for sustainable farming, of course, sits SFI. Now, a lot of farmers have said that they found it difficult to get into SFI. So we're simplifying it, making it easier to get into, and increasing the number of actions that SFI will cover. I think it's going up to 102 actions from 20 odd, 24, 23 at the moment. So that's a significant increase in what you can do with SFI money. That's intended to support farming to transition to more environmentally sustainable models, which are also more financially sustainable. If a farmer is farming in a way that is more regenerative, improves the quality of the soil, they don't have to spend so much money on buying fertiliser or potentially pesticides, depending on how they're farming, which are very high input costs for farming. So if we could help reduce their input costs while protecting the yields, then we can help farmers become more profitable. We're looking as well at what we can do on supply chain fairness. It's completely unacceptable that the producer of origin is so often forced to bear the majority of the weight of difficulties in the supply chain. And we need to look at supply chain fairness, the grocery code adjudicator, other adjudicators that are operating in the supply chain, the agricultural supply chain adjudicator, and how we can make the supply chain work more fairly for farmers. Now, take actions like that, and I won't rehearse the others because the chair will tell me off for going on too long, quite rightly. We can boost farming profitability, and I think that's what we should be focusing on right now.
Look, everybody's got to have their opportunity to have their say in this, and Tim now wants to come in really tight.
It will be brief, Chair, because I think
very tight in answer if we can.
Because we've had a good discussion as farmers would expect us to,
Indeed.
Especially today. And
that's why everyone has to have their say.
Thank you, and I thank you, Secretary of State, as well, for saying it's important to listen. And we've discussed tax planning implications for elderly farmers. We've talked about thresholds in some detail. We even, quite rightly, Chair, you raised the ROC Commission's recommendations as well around tenant farmers. But this budget had lots of measures in it. Andrew referred to some of them. I thought the disease threat money, the extra £200 million, was a positive step. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, biosecurity is essential, isn't it, to farming? We've seen the issues already with avian influenza in Yorkshire, hopefully, contained to that one incidence because of rapid intervention. We've seen blue tongue. Hopefully, the very cold weather that we've just got is going to help to deal with that. But by putting in restriction zones, that was able to be contained. But we know from 2001 when we had foot and mouth, that cost the economy £14 billion as a whole, and it was devastating to an awful lot of farmers. So it's vitally important that we invest in biosecurity. I believe the committee is due to visit the facilities at Weybridge. It's one of the first places I visited. You'll see, as I saw, that world-leading facility that helps keep our whole economy and food supply safe, not just farming. Right. Is dilapidated.
We are going to cover some of this later, so thank you, Tim. You maybe saved us a bit of time later on, but we'll come back to it. Right, we've finished on the first section. Sarah, can you take us on to environmental land management schemes, the budget and direct payments?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Secretary of State, I'll keep it sort of fairly brief, but you were talking about wanting farmers needing to forward plan, which is obviously very important, but farmers obviously have to base that forming and planning on the continuation of basic payments, and they had already planned based on expecting to receive them at these various points. So why have you accelerated the transition away from the direct payments coming in, and do you not recognise the strain that is also now putting on farmers?
Yeah, of course I recognise the strain, but we had to plug that multi-billion-pound black hole in the public finances.
Okay, the wider economic context we've really got, I promise you. Yep. I'm not underestimating the importance, but we've got that message. We're running down the clock now. Can we please just stick to the question? Yeah,
well, that context understood. Therefore, something in the budget had to give. It was important to protect SFI. because that is transitioning farming to a model that will be more environmentally and financially sustainable. Those are benefits we want the farming sector to get, but also it's more nature positive. This is one of the most nature depleted countries on earth. Half of our bird species and a third of our mammal species are at risk of extinction. So we need to transition farming to those new, more sustainable models for the sake of nature as well. Now, SFI, based on all those measures, offers good value for money. Basic payments doesn't. Basic payments was due to end in 2027 anyway. We took the decision that if something had to give, it was better to focus on that than on SFI, which is leading us towards the future. The approach we took to reducing basic payments was to try to protect the most vulnerable farmers. So those smaller farmers that rely on that income the most have had the smallest reduction in their payments. The bigger farms that could afford it the most have had the bigger reductions. That struck me as fair and proportionate, but there's been a big welcome in the sector, including from the NFU, for the way that we've balanced these two. The president of the NFU, perhaps not my biggest fan today, but he did put on record that he thought we'd taken the right approach in the balance between BPS and SFI and protecting SFI.
You're done. Henry, did you want to come in on this?
Yes. So how many applications have we had for SFI 24? Because you combined the mid-tier countryside stewardship with SFI 23 to come out with SFI 24.
I have my colleague who has a head for detail here with me. He can give you the exact numbers.
Thank you. So I'm Emily, Director General for Food, Biosecurity and Trade at DEFRA. So currently we have had we've had 16,500 expressions of interest for SFI 24. Of whom 15,460 have been invited into the service. Actual submitted applications, we've had 6,800, more or less. And so far we have offered agreements to 3,500. We're getting about 450 to 500 applications a week.
So how quickly are you handling that in terms of that 15, what's that speed looking
so
like?
The average performance is about 22 days for turnaround, but that's an average. And we do have some cases that have been around for much longer. So there are some who've waited more than 3 months. But we're trying to reduce that at the moment. But the average is 22 days. And that compares to countryside stewardship before, which was about 6 months of a turnaround time.
What's the speed of handling for questioning from the RPA?
So for SFI, mostly what's happening is that I think there's one action which requires additional checking from another body, but the RPA is largely putting this through their own systems and then making the agreements. There had been a situation in August and September where there was manual checks going on, but that's now been automated, so it's going to be more swift now.
So you don't have the figures in terms of how long that's taking in terms of the questioning put to the Royal Payment Agency.
You could maybe write to us with the answer, because we're getting into quite
what
granular
you mean by questioning,
territory.
I'll pick it up with you afterwards.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you. Jane, you wanted to ask?
Yes, just very quickly to follow on from that. I don't suppose we know much of a breakdown of who's applying for those. I mean, is it the small farmers, the large farmers? And what the impact will be on the family farms, really, of the changes with the basic payments.
I don't have that information to hand. I can go and find out what.
Okay.
You could perhaps write to us with that.
That's quite important to look at that impact going forward.
Yeah, I mean, it is open to all farmers. So.
Okay.
Chair, would you like us to send that information to the committee or to the individual?
If you can send it to the committee,
Yep.
We'll disseminate it, and we'll be aware, we'd expect, with the agreement of the committee, to put it into the public domain.
Right.
We are talking in the next session about the advisory services that there are to help farmers do that, because that's really important as well.
Yeah, I can say something about that as well if you'd like.
Sure.
Briefly.
Just, I mean, at the moment we're spending £20 million on environment advice and facilitation. We also put £17 million through the Farm Resilience Fund, which then also gives money to charities which can help farmers.
Okay. Henry?
Just on the higher tier countryside, can you a bit of an explanation, because I believe it's closed at the moment. It's being run by Natural England. Is that right?
So the higher tier, there's advice that Natural England offer, and then Royal Payments Agency make the payments.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. Moving on. Future of elms and farming, Sarah.
Thank you, Chair. Interesting to see the figures for SFI. It seems to have picked up after a very slow start, but it seems to me that farmers still aren't incentivised to move into these schemes, and I think that is, given the news in the budget, and I think that is a really interesting dilemma that farmers are going to be facing now over the next couple of years as they look to invest in their farms. Particularly as we're looking at young farmers coming into the industry. So what steps is the Secretary of State taking to optimise the ELMS schemes? And what's your vision beyond ELMS as we transition into a modern farming? And particularly, my interest is how we are going to get farmers to invest in farming in the future.
Well, I think you've heard earlier, so I won't repeat all of it, but we're trying to simplify SFI so it's easier to get into, particularly for those farmers who have told us they found it very difficult to get into in the first place. But we're also dramatically increasing the number of actions that you can get funded by SFI from 24 to 102 actions, I think, in the expanded SFI that's now available and that people are applying to. So I think by simplifying it and expanding it, that helps. We're also working on a farming roadmap, and this is how you. The original intention of the ELMS schemes, and we supported it at the time. I support it still. It's to help farming transition towards models of farming that are more environmentally and financially sustainable into the future. And you see a lot of farmers at the cutting edge of this that are really demonstrating how you can put it to maximum effect in making that transition. But not all farmers are yet going on that journey. So we're looking at what we need to do to make the SFI schemes and other ELM schemes more accessible and effective at supporting farmers as they go on that transition. But I'm very interested in looking at how we can support those farmers in the sector already who are pioneering these approaches and help them to bring the rest of the sector with them. I think farmers are much more willing to listen to other farmers that are already doing something well than they're prepared to listen to politicians, civil servants or government departments. So I'm very interested in models of co-production, of how we go on a journey towards transitioning farming. I think there's other things we can do to support farmers in that. We will be publishing a land use framework within the next few weeks or months, but as soon as we can get that out of the door, I think that will help, because it will give the whole sector a better sense of how we want to balance nature's recovery with food production and protect food security while we also are protecting nature. And some of the planning reforms that my colleagues in the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government are leading on are intended to speed up the planning process so that farmers, landowners can get a planning decision far quicker, which makes an investment a much more attractive proposition because they can much more quickly realise a return on that. I was very struck when I was told by a landowner farmer that it took them nearly 10 years to get planning permission to link sustainably and energy generation to the national grid. It should take months, if that, not years.
In some cases. Jane, are you finished in that? Can I bring in Sarah and Andrew? You wanted to come in on this, or were you wanted to come in on this? You're not, okay. Sarah.
Secretary of State, can I just check you that do you feel farmers are going to feel incentivised to innovate given the decision in the budget?
Yes, I do, because the most farmers won't be affected by it. And I've already explained, I won't do it again because the chair will wrap my knuckles, but the various interventions that we've got to help farmers become more profitable and to incentivise them to invest, because they will get a return on that investment faster.
Okay. Were you wanting?
Just very quickly, the current ELM system is quite it's phrased sort of pick and mix, I suppose. Farmers can choose what they apply for. Are you thinking of moving towards a system that's maybe more more of a balance, so that we know when we have that land management system, so we know what we're aiming at, so we can assist farmers with knowing where they should be putting that investment.
I think farmers having discretion in this is important, because people are much more willing to go on a journey if it's a journey they want to go on. If there's a sense of coercion, I don't think that would happen. But I also think, sensible business owners of any kind, including food production and farming, want to know what is the strategic direction that the government wants to go in as well. And I think by publishing a land use framework, as we'll do probably early in the new year, I think that's right, it will give farmers a much better sense of how we intend to balance our ambitions, both for 30 by 30 and nature's recovery, with food security and food production and a thriving food production sector. Currently, without a land use framework being published, people have to guess what our approach to that would be. With the land use framework out there, people will be able to interrogate it, and we won't publish the land use framework cold. We'll go out to consult on the best way to shape that land use framework, so everybody who has a stake in what it looks like can influence the final shape of it. And again, for me, co-production on that is a very important part of the approach we want to take, so that farmers and food producers and growers feel involved in the decisions that will affect them.
So that money doesn't all end up in things like biodiversity banks, for example.
All of which takes us on quite neatly, actually, to questions in relation to land use and food security. Tim, do you want to lead on this?
Well, you started to address that point, Secretary of State, about consulting with stakeholders over the framework. I wondered how you saw the balance in competing demands for land use.
Well, actually, we need coordination across government to get this right. Within DEFRA, we'll be publishing in the new year, early in the new year, a consultation on a land use framework that will look at how we balance nature's recovery with food production. Those are the parts that DEFRA will be responsible for. But there are other spatial strategies in government that the land use framework will have to work in tune with. The spatial development plan that MHCLG is developing, and the spatial plan for energy infrastructure that DESNES will be working on. Now, they're separate but interrelated frameworks, and if they don't correlate with each other, then they won't be maximally effective, either individually or collectively. So the departments are working together to make sure that each of these frameworks takes all of the others into account, so that we can really make the best use of the limited amount of land that we have for the size of our population and the many, many demands that we want to place on that land. I think it's far better to go ahead with visible frameworks that people can influence than the current model, which is basic. We allow everything to be randomised, and I don't think that gives you the best outcomes.
That's really helpful, Secretary of State. So does that mean that the framework will identify multifunctional compromises clearly between those departments?
Yeah, I think it'll have to. Yeah. I think it'll have to, because there will be some cases where the same land is used for multiple purposes. But at least by going out with these consultations and developing these strategies, we have a sense of it. By defining what it is we want to achieve, we're much more likely to be able to achieve it. I was going to make a more general point about this as well. We've got. I'm talking about a number of frameworks that are being developed here. The farming roadmap, the land use framework, I think we touched on the circular economy at one point. We've got the Water Commission as well. It's not very often in the cycle you get all of these new agendas being developed all at the same time. And I think there's a real opportunity for my department and the Select Committee to work together on that, to influence these agendas. They're almost like interlocking pieces of a jigsaw. They're not separate strategies. They all combine to make sense of what we do with our land as a country and the natural assets that are in our country and how we use them for the benefit of the entire population. So for me, this is quite an exciting moment, and I would very much welcome the opportunity to partner with the Select Committee in developing these agendas.
Thank you. You happy? Andrew, you wanting to come in on this?
Yeah, I want to ask a couple of questions to get your thoughts around food security. So it's a very exciting time, but probably you are the Secretary of State who's taken over the department at one of the maximum periods of insecurity facing the world, let alone farmers. Today marks the 1,000th day since Putin's illegal invasion of the Ukraine, which has multiple implications on the world, one of which is around food production, supply chains, what's happened to fertilizer costs and energy costs around it. But actually it's been a decade in which we've seen supply chains and food and farming hit by COVID, by some of the ramifications or implications of our transition or non-transition post-Brexit in terms of what it means of our place in the world and where food sits into it. And I don't think anyone will argue the world will be less secure in the decade ahead. So I'm really interested about how important you see domestic food production to our food security within the context of this increasingly insecure world that we're facing.
Yeah. Well, I think the points you make are very important. If anyone wasn't aware that food security is national security, what happened in Ukraine, what happened in the Red Sea, what happened during the pandemic would have showed them that it is. And I think the answer to that isn't to just close the borders and try to produce everything we want to eat in the country, but we have to have an appropriate level of domestic production that balances with secure supply chains for some of the food that we can't or don't want to produce in the country. And perhaps over time that balance will change. Now, supply of food that is secure and resilient is essential to food security. That's both domestic and international supplies. The quality of the food that we're accessing as well. There are good calories and there are bad calories. You can fill yourself up on food that isn't nutritious. If we're doing that as adults, that's our own free choice. But if that's happening to children and it's damaging their physical and mental development, then that is something that we would all be concerned about, both as parents or as people that want to see the rising generation succeed. And of course we want food, high quality food, to be affordable to people as well. So all of those have to be taken into account when you're looking at what food security is. Then there's the impacts of climate, the climate crisis. We've seen the flooding in Spain. Happily doesn't seem to have affected the food production we rely on, but absolutely devastating to people living in the towns and villages and cities that were affected. And then we've also got droughts that are also damaging food supply. And of course, flooding and droughts affect food production in our country as well. And one of the things I was pleased about in the budget was that we found 60 million to help farms that have been devastated by flooding earlier in the year to be able to recover. But we need to look at more how we can help protect food production domestically from some of those severe weather incidents that happen much more frequently today. And then international supply chains as well. It's important that those supply chains that we're relying on are secure and reliable. So all of that comes into food security.
What's the definition of food security? What are the metrics that you are measuring in order to know so that one day we can say we are food secure?
Well, we've got the food security reports that will be published in December. That will give you a hell of a lot of metrics around what food security looks like.
That's the route that you're following, because I recall you weren't massively impressed with it in the past.
Well, I mean, there's a whole load of data in there, and that's what we'll be looking at. I mean, at core, what I think food security is about is a secure and resilient supply of good quality, accessible, affordable food. But there's so many metrics that will come into that. You'll need to give me time You'll need to give me time to pick out the ones that I think are the most important within that. Imports will play a part in food security. I don't think we can seek to become. We never have been.
I've spoken often about the Orkney avocado harvest. Yes. Charlie, then Sarah, and I'll come back, Andrew. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair.
Just very briefly.
The recent announcement of COP around the 81% reduction in emissions by 2035. Now, the Climate Change Committee say that can only be achieved with a significant reduction in the production of meat and dairy. So has that been taken into account, and is that now part of the long-term food security plan to see a reduction in overall domestic food?
No, I think people should and will make their own choices about what they want to eat. It's not for government to tell people eat this or don't eat that. In my experience, what people want is good quality information to help them make the best possible choice. If you look at, in this country, there was a report, I forget the name of the report, but it's about February of this year, there was a report published into the health of our children, and our children are becoming shorter, fatter and sicker compared to previous years. And a large part of that is because of the food that they are eating. Now, no parent would choose to make their child shorter, fatter or sicker. The parents are not getting the information they need to make informed choices. So I'm very interested. Just
meat and dairy don't make you short.
I'm very interested in what we can do to provide more information to consumers to make their own choices. I'm not interested at all in the government telling people what they can eat.
Okay. Andrew, you want to come back and say that very briefly?
Yeah, just want to have a quick comeback. So, really good to hear you talk about food security. You're the food security champion within government. I'm really interested in how, given this cuts across so many different departmental responsibilities. We talk about imports, exports, domestic production, but we've actually seen imports being advantaged by disastrous trade deals we've seen in recent years. How do you see yourself using your role as a food security champion to make sure our friends in international trade, DBT, DSIT, there is a whole range around DEFRA which orbits you are the sun of food security. There are moons and planets that orbit around you. Yeah. How are you going to use that to make sure we don't see trade deals and other areas which disadvantage British farmers in the name of food security?
Well, on your specific point on trade deals, I was very pleased we had a line in the manifesto that ruled out trade deals that undercut farmers on things like welfare and environmental standards in the way that the Australia-New Zealand trade deal did. That was catastrophic for farmers, and there'll be no more of that. There'll be any of that from this government. But on your wider point, what we don't have as a government is a food strategy. And we've started to talk to colleagues in other departments about how we can start to work towards that. Very early stages at the moment. It's another area where I'm sure the committee will want to take an interest and may wish to contribute. But Henry Dimbleby, I'm sure, is known to many of you. Promoted the idea of a food strategy. Would tell you that if you don't have a food strategy, that is a food strategy. It's just a very bad one. Yeah. It's one of the things that is leading to our children becoming sicker and less healthy than they used to be, with all the damage that does to their life chances. I'd rather we had an explicit food strategy that was focused on delivering the outcomes that parents and members of society would wish to see for themselves and for their families. So that's something that we'll work on. It's at very early stage at the moment, but it's another of those agendas where I think we can make a big difference.
Look, we've done the difficult stuff. We're going to move on to the water sector now. Jane, can I ask you to kick off on this, please?
I get the water sector because Cornwall is surrounded by water on three sides. So
like Orkney and Ship.
So yes, just to start, obviously the government has announced a major review of the water sector. So I think the first thing to look at would be the scope of that. How wide is it? Would the review consider alternative models of water company ownership, maybe complete form of the regulator? Will it be that broad? When will it report? And how will it fit into the government's overall strategy for the water industry? Will this be part of a very long-term set of measures, or is this going to be the be-all and end-all?
Yeah, I'm worried the chair's going to ask me for a short answer to that huge question.
Sorry,
I'll try and keep it as concise as I can. Of course, the commission that Sir John Cunliffe is leading is part of a wider strategy, and we took the first steps towards that. It was 7 days after the general election. I had the chief executives of the water companies in my office, and we agreed an initial package of voluntary reforms, and that included changing their corporate objectives to put customer and environmental interests at the heart of the decisions that they're taking, but also to ring-fence money that is earmarked for investment so that it can not be diverted for payment on bonuses or dividends. I think the public want that reassurance. I was very pleased that the water companies agreed to do that voluntarily, because they understand, as I understand, as I'm sure we all do, there is a crying need for a reset in the water sector because of the high level of public anger at the state of our rivers, lakes and seas and the record levels of pollution that is in them today. So initial set of reforms straight away. Going through Parliament right now is the Water Special Measures Bill, which takes action on some of those unfair bonuses that water chief execs were rewarding themselves for overseeing failure. There's other measures in there as well. Happy to go into those if the chair wants me, but I'll move on if not.
We've all been in the debate.
The third stage of these initial reforms was to invite Sir John Cunliffe to lead a commission that will be looking at the water sector in its entirety. So that's looking at governance, regulation, how the water sector is structured, how we can move to catchment-based approaches to water management, so we can see all of the factors that are influencing pollution in a particular catchment and then tackle them collectively so we can clean up our water. You know, about 40% of what goes into the water as pollutants comes from agriculture, about 50% from water from sewage, and about 10% is from highways runoff, or and there will be other smaller sources as well. We have to tackle all of them. So we've charged Sir John with looking at the entire sector to reset it. The first time in 35 years since privatisation that this has been done. Sir John, I think, is a very good choice to lead this review. He was the Deputy Governor of the Bank of England. He was the second Perm Sec in the Treasury. He understands regulation. He understands investment. He has a high level of credibility. We want an investable water sector that works for customers and works for the environment, and that's what he's been charged with delivering.
Everything is on the table there. Governance, regulation, everything.
I'll come to your a couple of your other points. When will it report? It's intended to report in June of next year. I'm sure the committee may wish to make your own submissions to Sir John on the work that he's doing. In terms of ownership, we are looking at how we reform a privately owned regulated water sector. So we're not looking at nationalisation. That's ruled out because the costs of doing it would be absolutely prohibitive, upwards of £100 billion to buy out the current owners. It would take years to untangle the current models of ownership, during which time water pollution would get worse because the companies would have no incentive to invest in cleaning up the water. And I genuinely don't believe that the problem is ownership, because there are nationalised water companies that have similar problems with pollution to privately owned water companies. The failures are failures of regulation and governance. So that's what we've charged Sir John with looking at and coming up with a new model that genuinely will be a reset moment for the water sector in this company, so we can get it delivering for customers and for the environment in a way that it hasn't done in recent decades.
A few to go through, so I'll carry on. Ofwat's looking at a price review for the water sector now. Obviously, we know over the previous years there's been a lot of money taken out of that sector and not much investment. So to what extent should consumers now have to shoulder and take on the upfront capital costs, which will be large, to tackle that water pollution and ensure water's secure for the future?
Well, whatever happens, the consumers won't be taking up the upfront capital cost. Because the purpose of the review is to bring in the investment from private sector investors into the sector. Then they will be looking at a long-term, low but fair return on that investment, and that's how we can sort of keep customer bills affordable during that process. But it brings in, based on the draft determination, which may change by the time we get the final determination from Ofwat December, but based on the figures in the draft determination, that's upwards of £88 billion coming on stream from April next year to start investing in our broken water infrastructure. That is how we start to clean up the pollution.
Have you had expressions of interest from investors then into doing that? Is that why you're...
Well, personally, no, because it goes through the water companies themselves. But I have had meetings with the Financial Secretary of the Treasury, Spencer, as I know him, with the investors at round tables to understand their concerns about investability into the sector. At the Growth Summit at the Guildhall, we again met with investors to understand what they're looking for to make the sector more investable. There are plenty of investors out there who want to invest in a well-regulated and successful water sector. So the work that Sir John is carrying out to get proper regulation into the system also makes the sector more investable, because investors want to invest in an enterprise that is succeeding for their customers. They're not happy at all about the state of the water sector and the state of pollution and the state of public anger about that. Those are failures of governance and regulation that we as government can help to correct, and that is why I've charged Sir John with carrying out this work.
Kind of thing.
Yeah, the two things are going hand in hand, because we need that investment coming in April. Just out of interest, even at 88 billion, and it may change, that would be the single biggest investment in the water sector in its history in this country, and the second biggest private sector investment in any part of the economy for the entire lifetime of this Parliament. So it's a very significant piece of work.
Move quickly on I've got quite a lot about water.
Yeah.
Pollution.
Yeah.
So there is a lot of pollution in our inland water as well as our coastal areas, but it's from different things. So partly it's from sewage, but agriculture, industry and landfills as well. So what steps are you taking to tackle all of those different pollution?
Again, huge question there. I might say so. I mean, I won't repeat what we're doing on sewage, because the amount of investment that we're hoping will be coming in starting in April is how we start to fix that, alongside the work that Sir John will be leading on reforms of governance and regulation. On agricultural runoff, I referred earlier on to the farming roadmap. We want to work with farmers, so farmers are leading these reforms. But if we can support farmers to move to more regenerative models of agriculture that require less fertiliser dumped on poor quality soil and fewer pesticides dumped on crops, then you reduce the runoff into water. There's other things you can do as well, but what you grow up alongside the rivers, the barriers that you can put, the buffers to stop things running off. But by reforming agriculture, we can reduce the runoff in that way. And on landfill, we haven't spoken very much yet about the circular economy. That's another of our big priorities. Excellent. It's another of our big priorities in the department. There are so many benefits from moving to a circular economy. One of them, of course, is we have far less landfill, far less waste going into landfill. I would much rather we find ways to reuse materials than that we incinerate them or bury them in the land. So, a very big priority for the department is a circular economy. It also happens to help grow the economy. So there are many, many reasons why it's right that that's one of our priorities.
Carry on with the last couple.
Can we do another 2 minutes on this, and then I do want to move on to biosecurity.
Water resilience is the next thing. So drought, flooding and disrupted water supplies, of which we've had quite a lot lately. Yeah. What is the government doing to tackle all three of those things, which are obviously very different?
Well, it links back to that investment coming in. Frankly, water infrastructure in this country is in an appalling state, and that's why we've got record levels of sewage. But it's also why you've got problems in Cornwall, where last year you had both the hosepipe ban and flooding at the same time, because the infrastructure can't capture the water and then get it to where it needs to be. It's constraining growth in areas around Cambridgeshire. The house development can't go ahead because the clean water infrastructure isn't there. In Oxfordshire, it's the absence of sewerage that is constraining growth. Now, we want growth. Growth is the top priority for this government. It's how we get in the money to fund our public services to give this country the wage rise that they need. But water infrastructure is critical to all of that. So the money that we intend to bring in through the conclusion of the PR24 process and the reforms to governance, as I say, upward of £88 billion, that's how we get the new infrastructure built. And I think as well, just to leave you with a little teaser, I think the Thames Tideway Tunnel is a really good example, a really interesting example of how a collaborative approach to developing water infrastructure can happen with a slightly different ownership and governance structure. It's a huge project delivered on budget and on time, and there are a lot of lessons in that for what we can do for other major water infrastructure up and down the country. And I'm drilling into that in my role. It may be something you'd be interested in looking at as well.
We're seeing Ofwat next week for an evidence session, so we'll maybe pick up in rather more detail some of this. I do need to move on.
I'll ask one question.
Very, very short question.
On enforcement. So I appreciate it's different in Wales in England with the Environment Agency, Natural Resources Wales, but Natural Resources Wales only progressing with enforcement on 4% of instances reported. So that's obviously very, very low. I don't know what the figures are for the Environment Agency, but be interested to know what the department is doing in order to bulk up that enforcement.
Yeah. Well, there are some measures in the Water Special Measures Bill that's going through the House of Lords now and should be in the Commons very soon that will strengthen enforcement by claiming back the costs of enforcement action from a successful prosecution against the water company, so it generates more resources to carry out more enforcement. So that's in the Water Special Measures Bill. More widely, I've asked Dan Corrie to lead a review of DEFRA regulators. There are some overlaps in the functions of some regulators. Over time, organisations can potentially lose sight of their initial objectives and start doing other things. So I want to make sure that DEFRA's regulators are fit for purpose. They're carrying out the job that they were intended to carry out. There are not overlaps that are confusing the regulated in terms of what the regulator is doing, but also that they're promoting the government's growth agenda, because what I don't want to happen is regulators getting in the way of the primary mission of this government. So there's another piece of work there that I think will start to touch on the question that you just raised there.
Right, I'm going to move on. Biosecurity, Chairman.
Yep, I'll try and rattle through this, thank you.
Yep.
An area which I think we all agree with is very important. I'll start off with the broader target operating model. Can I just get your view on assessment on the implementation of that, maybe particularly around Sevington and the operations there?
Well, it's still bedding in, isn't it? It's an intelligent-led model. It's risk-based. It's contingent on the deal with the European Union as well, that isn't yet fully operating in the way that it should be. But we've got a watching brief on that, really. I think that's that's probably the best.
Is your impression that things are improving? Because I've heard various anecdotal stories about loads, not just livestock, but also plants, flowers, etc. And some issues there. I don't know what you're...
I do think it's improving. Before this job, I was Chief Executive of the Food Standards Agency, so we obviously had quite a key interest in what was going on at the border there as well. There's been additional things rolled out in the last few months. For example, in October at Sevington, they intercepted 34 consignments of plants infested with a fruit tree pest. So they are catching things. The sort of timeliness of things going through and being picked up, I think, is improving. We occasionally still get consignments which are stuck, which need to be progressed through, and I think that sort of feedback loop to the Port Health Authority and then beyond needs improving, but we're getting there.
Yeah. I think we had the same reverse issue when obviously the implementation of checks came in on the EU side, and we had a rocky few months, but it did smooth out in time. Just on to an area that I've spent the last 2 years plus lobbying the previous government on, and around biosecurity at our borders, the organised crime imports of illegal meat products in large volumes that Dover in particular have got some great insight on, and yet they don't have the necessary funding really to police the border as they would choose to as a Port Health Authority. I know that's the same with other Port Health Authorities as well. Has there been any progress, any news on that in terms of being able to secure the funding?
So there's been an allocation for this year. We haven't agreed yet what we'll be giving them for next year, so I can't report that yet.
Yeah. Are they satisfied with the allocation for this year?
I don't think Dover will be satisfied, because I think that they will always feel there's more to do, and I think that's true of any enforcement authority. But we will do our best.
Yeah. I do understand.
But it is one we're very aware of as well, particularly African swine flu and illegally imported meat from certain countries in Eastern Europe in particular. There are real concerns about that, so that's something we're keeping a real watching brief on as well. Yeah. We'll see how that situation develops.
It's crucial because, as you say, it's countries with African swine fever unable to export their meat products at the moment that are being exploited, and this meat's coming into the country. I appreciate you can't stop every vehicle without bringing the whole thing to a halt, but anything we can do to try and prevent that coming into this country would be greatly appreciated. And finally, just moving on to Weybridge, obviously we're due a visit there shortly. Yeah, I'm sure we're all acutely aware of the funding it requires for a full rebuild. There was £200 million allocated in the budget. Are you still making representations to the Treasury to get the extra 1.4 you would still need?
You would need after that. For all the reasons that you'll be very aware of, it's essential that we maintain the world-leading status of the facilities at Weybridge and the APHA. It is about national security. It's as important as that. The devastation that happened from foot and mouth cost the country £14 billion, and to the farming sector, disproportionately heavy impact there as well. So we've secured the 200 million, as you said. Spending review phase 2 is about to start. We'll be having conversations across government and with the Treasury about that, but of course I'll be making representations around biosecurity.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Right. I've got a couple of people wanting to come in on this, and I am determined that Josh Newbury, who is my favourite committee member, a model for everyone, in sitting patiently, and I'm determined that Josh is going to get some time. Secretary of State, I understand you can maybe give us another 10 minutes or so. We've got questions on fairness in the food supply chain and a couple of points just to finish this, and then I promise we'll be done.
Well, you're only saving me from the media
for today.
Chair, so that's
Andrew, then Sarah, very quickly.
You're a very indulgent, Chair, and I promise this will be my last hot
One of my
pursuit.
biggest weaknesses.
And we love you dearly for it, for the record. Wearing my previous hat, before I came here, I was an official for Prospect, which looked after many of the specialists in biosecurity at the airports, at the ports and other areas. One of the ongoing challenges was about the ageing workforce and the impact of austerity under previous regimes, which cut the number of people who could actually do the inspections and look after our borders. So I'm really interested, with all the ambition and the greater risk we face now, could you talk to us or come back to us about the preparedness of the workforce and workforce planning, so we actually have the professionals who can keep us safe at our borders?
And actually, Sarah's question leads on naturally from that, so I'll take them both together and then get the answer.
I can say some.
So if I can just ask the question, I particularly want to know about the assessment that you've made around vet shortages and how you're going to work across government to tackle that problem, and how you're going to achieve a potential veterinary agreement with the EU.
I'll take the workforce ones, then you can talk about the veterinary agreement.
vet deal.
So the two things. One is that there has been money to support health authorities, which has meant that they've been able to recruit more people. I nevertheless, partly with my previous experience, think that there is a shortage of environmental health experts in the country, and I think that is a sort of strategic issue that needs addressing. So I think there's a workforce planning issue in the round about environmental health and that expertise, some of which is used at ports. That goes to the same with vets. So there is and the Food Standards Agency used a lot of vets, as does the Animal Plant Health Agency. And having been at the FSA, I now find myself in the post where I was lobbying to try and get someone to do something more about vets. So it's now my responsibility to solve this as well. But yes, because of a number of factors in the last 5 years or so, additional export health certification work, the pet boom that's happened, and then just issues about retaining vets in their professions. There is pressure on vets, which means that we're seeing salaries go up. And it can be harder to get vets into the public health world that we know in particular. So I think that we need a strategic approach to that, and there are proposals from the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons around the Veterinary Surgeons Act that would make a significant difference. It would be up to the government to decide if it wanted to pursue those and then to get parliamentary time. But
we have had these proposals for many years, possibly decades, from the RCVS.
At least some
on some
years.
future occasion we'll maybe ask you what you're going to do about it, but not for today. Secretary of State, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, on the CICA deal with the EU, SPS deal with the EU, we were clear through the general election that this is something that we are looking for. It's part of our reset of relations with the EU, so we have a stronger relationship, more collaborative relationship with the EU, short, of course, of re-entering the single market, the customs union, or returning to free movement. But it's in the interests of both sides, I think, to smooth relations and to smooth trade. Exports are down 20%, food exports, since 2018 to the EU. That's had a big hit on many food producers and growers. It's something they want the government to correct. So we have now a cabinet subcommittee on relations with the EU, which I attend to speak to issues related to the SPS deal. The negotiations are being led by my colleague, the Cabinet Office Minister responsible for EU relations, and we will be looking at a deal that gets our food exports moving across the border again, but also protects the interests of our food producers on land and in sea here at home.
Okay. Thank you. Josh.
Thank you, appreciate it, Chair. I'd just like to move on to fairness in the food supply chain, which I think is something that affects all of our communities. Now, post-budget, lots of supermarkets, Sainsbury's for example, have said that particularly the increases in employers' national insurance and the minimum wage could lead to increased food prices for consumers. So what assessment has DEFRA made of the potential for that and the impact it might have?
Well, I mean, I'll be speaking at the Food and Drink Federation's Investment Summit tomorrow. I'm looking forward to it very much because we have one of the world's most vibrant food and drink sectors. It's extremely competitive. That is one of the ways that we manage to keep both the variety of food products high, but the costs very competitive. And I think that will continue. That will continue to be the case. If you're looking at supply chain fairness through the whole system, there are a number of things that we're looking at. One, the supply chain does seem unfair to the producer of origin too often. You speak to producers very often that will tell you that they have been forced to sell their produce at below the cost of production. Absolutely not sustainable. One of the reasons why, earlier on in the session we were talking about the low profitability in the farming sector. We need to do something about that. So we're looking at the Groceries Code Adjudicator and how we can strengthen them to intervene as appropriate to ensure that the supply chain is operating fairly. Similarly, the Agricultural Supply Chain Adjudicator, who carry out a similar role. But we also have the new fair dealing obligation regulations, initially focused on milk, where some of those abusive relationships were really damaging milk providers, but that will move on now to look at other sectors. I think pork is the next sector along, but we'll seek to roll that out. But we're absolutely committed to making farming more profitable and supply chains fairer for the producers of origin. We depend on them for the food that we all enjoy, and we need to do what we can to support them in the supply chain.
Great, I really welcome what you said on that. If I just may share just a couple of follow-ups. So you've talked earlier about the proposed changes to public procurement, leveraging the power of the public purse in supporting British producers. But how will you make sure that not just wholesalers but farmers benefit from that, particularly smaller farmers? So I'm thinking, I come from the NHS before I entered Parliament, and the NHS often reaches for big contracts with big producers, big companies. So how we'll make sure that filters down and really benefits our farmers. And if I may, just on the Groceries Code Adjudicator, you'll obviously be aware that the NFU is calling for the threshold to be lowered to £500 million from £1 billion. I asked a parliamentary question on this, and the Business and Trade response was kind of just to state the facts, really, rather than whether an assessment's been made of the merits of lowering the thresholds. If there's anything you could say on that, I'd really welcome that.
Well, let me look at the thresholds. I'm not sure whether that is within DBAT or DBT or DEFRA, but I can get back to you on that. Within public procurement, the government spends an awful lot of money on buying food, the public sector, one way or another. There's food for our hospitals, food for our prisons, other parts of the public sector as well. And it seems quite right to set the ambition to have 50% of that procurement spent on food that is locally produced and more sustainable as well, because then it's encouraging farmers along that farming roadmap to models of farming that are better for them financially as well as for the environment. So that is something that we will want to do. So local will specifically be in those requirements when we bring those in.
Anything further on that?
Just to touch on, will there be kind of guidance issued to public sector procurers on that, to how to make sure that local producers are benefiting, and that we're looking at things like fairness in the food supply chain? Obviously, you talked about how in the past and currently some supermarkets really don't treat farmers fairly. How will we make sure that that isn't then replicated through the public sector procurement? Obviously, it goes on already at the moment, but if we're talking about a massive expansion, how will we make sure that our British farmers are actually benefiting from that?
Well, we'll be putting the procurement rules together for how that will operate. So, being local and being sustainable will both be factors that will be required in that process when we develop it. So we'll develop it in that way. I mean, I'm sure it's something that the committee will, from your questioning, will be very interested in looking at when we bring that forward. perhaps in draft form. So that's something that we could work together on to make sure it works in that way. But I think promoting local producers is very, very important, so that you don't get these big juggernaut buyers just riding roughshod over them. Very important for regional and economic growth, which is something we want to promote as part of the growth mission. So it ticks all sorts of boxes. It's not just about food security, it is about economic growth as well, and healthy nutrition.
Great, thank you, Chair.
Done. Right, Secretary of State, there's other stuff we would love to ask you about. Fisheries, the circular economy, some of the cross-cutting work, but in order to encourage you to come back at a future date, I'm not going to abuse your good nature in offering us another 10 minutes. We've only used 6 of them. But look, we're very grateful to you for your engagement, your attendance today, and to your colleagues. David, we'll think about questions for you at a future date. But I'm sincere when I say that I do want this committee to be something which, by robust scrutiny, is able to add value to the work that you do, because ultimately that, I think, is where the best interests of all our constituents, and indeed particularly in rural communities, should lie. So thank you for your attendance, thank you for your cooperation to date, and I will at this point draw the meeting to a close. Order